Hi, I'm going to quickly overview knitting pattern reading. Many people first learn to knit and find that they really enjoy it, but don't keep up with it because they can't get into pattern reading. So I'm going to be explaining a little bit about the elements of a knitting pattern so that if you love knitting, you can go on to read other knitting patterns. The Zollie Beginner Knitting Kit is designed with a pattern that is very similar to most knitting patterns that you will find on the internet or in knitting magazines. There might be slight differences from one to the next, but most of these main sections are ones that you're going to find in almost all knitting patterns. First, you're going to find materials listed. So for this one, you have 2 cones of yarn, 1 pair of knitting needles, and a tapestry needle and scissors. Almost all projects you are going to need tapestry needle and scissors, but the main things to pay attention to when looking at a knitting pattern is the needles required. It will be listed in a European measurement, which is 4.5 millimeters, and the US measurement corresponds to it. You can find a bajillion knitting needle conversion charts online, so just Google. Each knitting needle has a different size. It's not one size fits all. And that's the same case for yarn. Yarn can come in a range of weights. It's what they call it. The word weight comes from looking at how many yards there are per certain amount of weight of yarn. Usually yarn is balled into either 50 or 100 grams, and then there'll be a different length associated. So bigger yarn has more material, less yardage per gram. Smaller yarn will go a longer distance with less yardage. So you'll often see a yardage listed under materials, and also a number of balls or skeins of yarn that go into a project will be listed here. So if you're gathering materials because you want to make something specific, you'll pay attention to the yarn weight and how many balls are required. Or if a project just says, for instance, that you need 650 yards of a specific weight of yarn, and the yarn is sold with 200 yards per ball, then you do a little bit of math and you find that you would need 4 balls in order to have enough yardage to do your whole project, and then you'd have a little bit of yarn left over. Obviously, our beginner knitting kit is paired with the right yarn for the project, but if you find a yarn that you fall in love with, you look at the weight of yarn listed on a pattern to make sure that it's the right yarn to use with the right pattern. And then you will get the right needle size to follow. The next thing that you're going to notice on a pattern is the gauge. So a gauge is a way of telling if you're using the right size yarn paired with the right size needle to get your project to come out to the desired dimensions, which are here, the finished measurements. So when you knit a swatch, you will knit a swatch based on what's represented here under gauge. It'll say something like our pattern, which says 17 stitches and 36 rows equal a 4-inch square on US 7 needles and garter stitch. So garter stitch is the stitch that is made here. And when you are looking at the gauge, usually what you'll do is just measure 1 inch. So you'll divide this up, or you can measure the whole thing. This is only 10 stitches, but if I knit the 17 stitch swatch by 36 rows, I would want to be able to measure it and know that it would be about 4 inches by 4 inches. Or I could divide those numbers by 1 and just measure how many stitches are in 1 inch. So for a project like our beginner washcloths, size is not super important. Utility is more important, but if you're knitting something that needs to be a certain size in order to fit your body dimensions, for instance, measuring the gauge is important so that you use the right yarn and the right needles for the project. So the needle size you can alter if your yarn is one that you really love and you know it's the right weight for the project, but your swatch is coming out kind of small, then you would use a larger needle size and you would swatch again to get the correct gauge. Or if your gauge was coming out where your swatch was too large, you could use a smaller set of needles than the ones listed on the pattern in order to obtain the correct gauge. So gauge is the measurements of stitches and rows per inch, and you can alter your needle size or your yarn size to get the correct gauge. Finish measurement is just self-explanatory. Finishing and care shows you how to, any special instructions that a pattern will require for finishing. This one's very straightforward, but there might be a special technique or blocking method that somebody might want you to be using. So that would be here under finishing and care. And then very important is to pay attention to the abbreviations that are used in the pattern. So because knitting patterns are often published in magazines, you want to be able to have as few words as possible. So these abbreviations, this started becoming the standard for knitting patterns. When you're reading a knitting pattern, instead of writing out, for instance, the word stitches, it's abbreviated by STS. The ones that are used in our pattern are pretty common to almost all knitting patterns. You're almost always going to find a K for knit stitch, a repeat, REP for repeat, right side, wrong side, stitches, cast on and bind off. But if a knitting pattern uses a new technique that you might not be super familiar with, like decreasing or increasing, where you are knitting 2 stitches together to decrease, that will be represented here as K2 TOG or something along those lines. So new techniques that you might need in order to knit a pattern are going to be represented here in the abbreviation row. And as you are working through a pattern and you come across an abbreviation that you don't know what it means, you should always be able to refer to the abbreviation section of your pattern to find out what a pattern is asking you to do that you don't know how to do yet, and you can look up how to do that technique. So the way that that ends up reading as you're going through a pattern is that when you're first learning, you might have to keep checking your abbreviations. What does that mean? But once you become used to the abbreviations, you'll tend to be able to go through these things pretty quickly. It's almost like learning an, abbreviated language. You get used to it and you almost don't need to check it anymore. It just becomes second nature. So those are the components of a knitting pattern that you will usually come across, and we hope that this video helps you not only understand our knitting pattern, but be able to really unlock the whole wide world of knitting patterns that are out there.